Welcome, everyone. Whether you are watching live or whether you are watching a recording either from YouTube or somewhere else, I am happy to have you here. Today, I'm going to talk about forming questions for data analysis. And I'm going to be using the word research question throughout the webinar, which I will talk about, but I did not want people who don't feel that they are doing research to feel like this would not apply to creating a question they might need data analysis for. So I didn't use that question in the title, but I will, again, I'll clarify that a little bit later. So we're going to talk about how do you make a good question that's oriented toward doing quantitative data analysis. But before we jump in, I want to welcome everybody and just give a little bit of background about the webinar. If you've been to my last two, this is probably super familiar. So this webinar is being given in a presentation format. I've already talked with the folks who are joining live about that. This webinar it's part of a series of webinars that I'm doing, and it is for what I call domain experts. It is not specifically aimed at statisticians, which does not mean that statisticians may not also enjoy it or get something out of it for themselves, but this is really aimed at people who are maybe traditional academic researchers or business people or policymakers, people who want to ask questions or do research that requires them to do some data analysis. But you don't want to become a statistician yourself necessarily. You're going to be somebody who is working with a statistician to accomplish this. As I mentioned, it is part of a series of webinars. This is the third one that I am doing in 2026. This one is going to be really more conceptual and process focused, so it's not really going to be technical. It's not going to be particularly quantitative. None of the webinars in this series are going to include programming or in-depth methods of approaching analysis. Again, this is not really to teach you to be a statistician. I feel like a lot of those resources exist. Some of them are free videos, some of them are training that you can sign up for and you may pay money for, but I feel like a lot of that already exists. So this is really for that specific group of people who want to feel a little bit more informed and want to increase their statistical literacy, but don't necessarily want to be the statistician themselves. All right, and I do have some other future topics coming up if you're interested that I've already planned. So one of them is going to be related to how you collect data and how that can relate to the analysis that you'll do. And it's going to include things like cluster sampling and repeated measures, some of those more complicated setups that I think are maybe more realistic in a lot of modern research. I'll talk about how to organize data because this is a question I get from a lot of the people that work with me is what's the best way to format my data for you to be able to work with it. We'll have a webinar focused on how do you identify what the appropriate analyses are for working with your data. And I'm going to talk about p-values at some point as well, because I think this is a current topic that not everybody feels like they understand very well. So I also want to talk about myself just a little bit. I think the people here probably know me, but if you are watching this on YouTube or if you don't know me that well, I'm an independent statistical collaborator. So I used to be in academia and I have gotten into independent practice for the last 10 years. I really personally enjoy working with people who don't feel like they have a strong statistical background. So I'm much more of a generalist and I like to approach a lot of different problems and I like people to feel confident in what they're doing when they work with me. So here's my webpage. If you'd like to learn more about me, it's www.krloveqcc.com. And if you'd like to email me, again, if you just want to say hi, if you have specific questions, if you have suggestions for future topics, here's my email address. It's kim@krloveqcc.com. All right. So let's move into what we're going to. Oh, I also want to mention today, if you have attended or viewed my last two videos or my last two webinars, this one's going to be significantly shorter. I feel like the last two have been pretty long. I haven't really had time for questions at the end. I don't know if people will want to ask questions, but we've really kind of run right to an hour. I thought I'd keep this one shorter, maybe more focused instead of going into as much detail. And if you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Or maybe people like the longer version. You're certainly welcome to let me know that too. I do plan to send out some kind of survey very soon to ask people, how they feel about the webinars that have happened so far. So if you like the shorter format that I'm doing today, great. If you prefer the longer format, you can also let me know that. So what are we going to talk about today? I'm going to start by talking about the importance of research questions and the role that they play in quantitative data analysis, quantitative studies. Again, as I mentioned, the term research questions, I'm going to apply that a little more broadly, and I will talk about that a little bit later on, and what I mean by a research question. But we are going to start by talking about why it's so important to have a good research question. Then I'll talk about what are research questions and the related concept of hypotheses. I think they often get lumped together, and there's a lot of good reasons they get lumped together, but I do want to distinguish between the two a little bit, and talk about maybe formal hypotheses versus maybe more general hypotheses. I also want to then talk about what are the important elements of research questions and hypotheses. So this is really the meat of what I'm going to talk about today. What should you have in your research question, or in your hypotheses? What really needs to be part of it? Maybe what needs to be formally part of it when you're writing it, at the beginning of your manuscript versus when you're sharing it with a statistician. Maybe you need more detail for that second scenario. I'm going to walk through a couple examples of some research questions and what we might need to fill them out a little bit. And then I'll give my final thoughts and I'll have time for questions if anyone has any questions. So let's go ahead. Let's talk about the importance of research questions. And I have a vocabulary note, as I mentioned before I get started. I do not want people who feel like what they do is not research, even if it requires quantitative analysis, to think that this webinar does not apply. So I did not include research questions in the title. But as far as the rest of this presentation and how I'm treating it, a research question in this presentation means your question of interest. So it's the question you're asking that's fueling your research or questions. You may have more than one. The vocabulary for this can really vary a lot from one area to another or from one application to another. So, for example, I work with a lot of DNP, Doctorate of Nursing Practice students. And a lot of times, something they have to do in order to get their doctorate is to do a quality improvement project. And there's a lot of sort of reinforcement from their institution that this is not research, it is quality improvement. They believe the distinction is that you're not generating new generalizable knowledge. I would argue you're generating new knowledge that is generalizable to your specific facility setting. But there's just some small distinctions that are sometimes made between a quality improvement project and a research project. But everything that I'm going to talk about in this presentation can apply to research or quality improvement or any other question that you may not feel is research. I've also seen that sometimes people feel like if it's not an experiment, it's not research. I also don't believe that's true, but again, I just don't want people to be confused by the vocabulary. So I also want to mention for today, when I use the term research question, I'm talking about for quantitative research. Certainly, you can ask qualitative research questions as well. That's not an area where I have a lot of training. So for me, I'm really going to be focusing on research questions in a quantitative sense. So that's the vocabulary that I'm using today and what I mean by research question. All right. So why are research questions important? This may be obvious, but I want to make sure that I go over it because I think it's something people know but kind of forget in practice. So research questions, they can guide your planning. And this is a very important function of a research question. If you have your research question up front, it really guides you in what kind of data you need to collect. I have certainly worked with people who, kind of start with the data set and then decide what research questions they can ask. I think this is especially common in a classroom setting. If you're learning, you may say, here's a data set. What kind of questions can you ask? Generally, though, you want this to be the other way around. You want your research question to be put together and well formed before you decide exactly what data you need to answer that question. And sometimes they come together, if you're working off of what someone else has done and you know that there's a big database that exists and you have a question that can be answered from it. Sometimes those come together, but for the most part, you're going to want to have your research question really well determined before you collect your data, before you start doing that piece of it. It also can guide the planning for your analysis. Um, Research questions. I previously gave a webinar where I talked about, what type of data do you have? And the type of data that you have can really lead to what type of analysis you pick. Research questions are the other big piece of what leads you to decide on a particular data approach because certain analyses answer certain questions or may answer them in a different way or may be more appropriate for what you're trying to do. So it's important to have your research question before you decide on an analysis as well. And it also can guide your qualitative pieces. So when I talk about that, again, I'm talking about in the context of quantitative research. But when you're planning, if you know what your research question is, that tells you what should go in your literature review and what you need to be educating yourself about and the context that you need to be including for someone who might be watching a presentation or reading a manuscript that you've put together. It can determine the context that you need to have kind of as the background for it. So research questions definitely guide your planning. The other thing that they do provides direction throughout a project. I worked with someone, I don't say I worked with somebody, but I chatted with someone the other day who kind of used the term North Star to represent like the thing that she turned to for guidance throughout a project. And a research question is definitely maybe the North Star that provides you with guidance that helps you navigate as you're going through a project. So sometimes you start working on a project and you realize that the data you have maybe aren't complete or maybe aren't correct in some way, or that there's a whole group of individuals that needs to be removed for some reason. All kinds of things can happen to your data as you're working through a project. And so one of the things I always do if we run into an issue like that is I always go back and then say, can we still answer this research question? If we have this different set of data, does this still answer the research question? If the analysis has changed, so sometimes you may plan for a particular analysis, maybe you have to pre-register, maybe you were just, when you were thinking about the data and applying for funding or whatever you were doing, you had anticipated that you would be able to do a particular analysis. Then you get the data and you realize that the format or the distributions or something about it doesn't work the way you want. Sometimes it's really easy to get caught up in just making the analysis work and you sacrifice some of the things you were going to be able to do. It's always important to directly check, does this still answer the research question? Maybe it answers it in a slightly different way that's still acceptable, or maybe it changes the research question too much. But we always have to go back and check with that research question when things change throughout a project. And finally, when you're writing up your research, when you're drawing your conclusions, when you're telling people what the important part of it is, and you're interpreting things, you always have to double check if your final conclusions answer your research question. Are you using what you've learned through the data analysis in a way that is still answering the question that you want it to answer? So this is why research questions are so important. I mentioned in the description, I described it as the backbone of a project. It's kind of what keeps the project straight and connected and all the different pieces functioning. If you continue to check back with your research question throughout, you should stay in relatively good shape. And it's not, and I don't want to say you can never change your research question, but that's change. Anytime you change your research question, you are really just changing the basis of a project. It is so essential to that project. So it is always important to consider that very carefully. So now that I've talked about why they're important, of course, I've assumed you have some basic concept of, a research question. It's a question you're trying to answer that's associated with your research. I want to define it though a little bit more formally than that and talk about the difference between research questions and hypotheses because they do kind of get lumped together a lot, the idea of a research question versus a hypothesis. Um, and so let's start by talking about research questions. So It's probably obvious, but research questions are questions. They should be questions and phrased as questions. Um, they can be what or how type questions, which are generally better for research. And usually that's the kind of question you end up answering regardless of how you asked your question. Or they can be simpler yes, no questions. So let's take, I have some examples of some research questions we can ask. So they can be as simple as like, how is X, where X is some variable, some measurement, something you want to learn about. How is it distributed in the population? So what is it? What does something look like in the population is a research question you can ask. What is the relationship? And that could be what's the relationship between two different variables, between multiple variables. But you want to know something about how those two variables work together in the population. So that's a question that could be part of a research question. What are the differences? So how are these multiple groups different from each other? How is this outcome different if I give them this new treatment versus this other treatment? So what are the differences? Um, and how do these items or how do these individuals go together? If you're doing, if you've ever done a cluster analysis, this is kind of a relationship question, but it's a little bit different. I want to know if these items actually come from the same construct, or I want to know if there is a structure to, are there different groups of people in this population that I want to try to identify? So those are all questions you can ask. All of these I have phrased in a how or what type way. Generally, by the time we get to the end of a project, we're not just interested in knowing, is there a relationship between two variables? If there is, I want to be able to talk a little bit about what it looks like. So, does the value of this variable help us predict what this variable is going to be? Or how strong is the relationship between these two variables? I usually don't just provide a yes or no answer. That's usually not really considered enough. But you could ask, is there a relationship? Are there differences? Do these items go together? Um, so that's a research question. Again, key thing is it's phrased as a question. I'll talk about this again, but a lot of times it's what does this look like? What's this relationship? What are the differences? We also then have hypotheses. Hypotheses sometimes go with research questions. Sometimes we only kind of have hypotheses. Sometimes we only have research questions. But a hypothesis is not a question. A hypothesis is a statement. And it's usually a statement that can be true or not true. The idea is it's something that we can test. And I can tell you, yes, this hypothesis is true. No, this hypothesis is not true. Though they do run parallel to research questions. So one thing is, I could say, there is or is not a relationship of these two variables or of these two things. There are or there are not differences between these two groups. Either way that I say it, it's a statement that I can kind of learn about through data. These items or these people in this population go together or they don't go together. Um, or I can say something more specific, right? These are more like equivalent to yes or no's, but I could also make a hypothesis that describes a relationship a little bit more. So I could say the relationship between these two variables, as this one variable increases, this other variable will tend to increase across the population. Or I think that the new treatment will be better than the old treatment in this way. You can have hypotheses that are more specific than just this thing exists or this thing does not exist. But either way, it is a statement and it is meant to be something that you can actually determine from data whether that statement is true or not. Let's see. You can have research questions, hypotheses, or both. I've already talked about this. The way that they are formalized. So I don't want to say that there's one way or one correct way to write down your hypotheses or write down your research questions that's appropriate for any situation. So it's usually formalized based on your guidelines for your final product. So if you're writing for a specific journal, or if you've been given instructions for creating a presentation, sometimes you will have guidelines that have told you how you are supposed to phrase your research question and your hypotheses. Sometimes it depends on your area of practice. People may be more used to research questions only, or they may tend to see research questions with sub-research questions under each one. So maybe there's a big question and there's more specific things underneath it, or maybe there's a research question that has multiple hypotheses associated with it. Also has to do with just your habits and your background and how you learned to talk about hypotheses and talk about research questions. So there's lots of different ways that you could write this for a manuscript. I also, though, want to go ahead and say that regardless of how you may choose to write it formally for your eventual audience, a lot of the things I'm going to talk about today may not be part of that formal written thing, but they are things that you need to think about and you need to know how they accompany your research question when you are working with a statistician. So there are things that a statistician will need to understand before they can really make sure they're answering your research question well. I do also want to address quickly the idea of formal hypothesis testing. So this is a little different from what I'm talking about. If you took a stats class, you probably learned about formal hypothesis testing, where you have maybe a null hypothesis like H naught and an alternative hypothesis, which might be written as, H1 or HA. And there are specific rules for how those are supposed to be written. This is related to what I'm talking about. And you can use the formal hypothesis testing hypotheses as your hypotheses. That's definitely something you can do, but you don't have to do that. Anytime you have a p-value as a result of an analysis, a formal hypothesis test has been done. That's just how it works. And it's definitely something that the statistician needs to understand. Statistician needs to understand what is your null hypothesis, what is your alternative hypothesis, what is your p-value telling you about those two things. But it's pretty easy to explain the results of a hypothesis test without ever using the words hypothesis test, without ever using the word null hypothesis or alternative hypothesis. As a statistician, that's something we can generally do. And it's not necessarily something that a someone I would call a client or that a subject matter expert needs to be familiar with. So you don't have to think that you have to understand hypothesis testing to write hypotheses, to write statements about what you think the outcome is going to be. Again, you certainly can if this is a framework you're familiar with, but you don't have to. And I'm really not going to talk about formal hypothesis testing more in this webinar. So um, now that we've kind of talked about what are research questions, what are hypotheses, as I said, this is sort of the meat of the presentation here. What does your research question really need to have in order for it to be answerable? Like, what am I? Again, this is kind of from my perspective that I'm sharing with you. What do I, as a statistician, want to understand about your question in order to feel like I know what the data analysis should look like and what kind of data we should be using? I'm going to start with a specific model for coming up with a question that I think helps get us in the right frame of thinking, but it is not an entirely general model. So it's not something that perfectly can translate to any question that you might want to ask. So this is the PICO model, if you've heard of this. Sometimes it's written with a T at the end, but the basic elements that you need is the PICO part, PICO. I can't think of the word for it, but it's an abbreviation. The P part is for your population. So anytime you're asking a question, you need to know who are you asking it about. It's pretty basic. And I don't think it's that people that I work with, generally have trouble determining what their population is. I do think, though, that sometimes the sometimes translating that population to what you actually have can be tricky. So we'll talk about that more in a little bit. I stands for intervention. Again, this is really more for comparative analysis, but if there's some treatment or something that some individuals, some units in your study are getting that others are not, This is your treatment, and you have to specify what that is. There may be more than one of them. C stands for comparison. So that's usually a control or current practice. Just what are you comparing your intervention or your treatment to? So that needs to be specified as well. And then the final thing that needs to be specified is your outcome. If you have an intervention and you're comparing it to something, what is it that you want to see if it's different between your intervention and the thing that it's being compared to? So this is a good model that oftentimes, especially again, if you're doing a comparative study or an experiment, um, really helps you identify all the different parts of what you need to do as you're asking your question. But again, it doesn't necessarily extend to every kind of question you might want to ask because we don't always have interventions. We're not always doing a comparison. So I'm going to back up and get a little bit wider now and talk about some of the things that we're really looking for in general that this reflects on. So in general, a research question needs to be specific. So it needs to mention a population, it needs to mention a group of people or animals or things that it applies to. And you need to have a good understanding of your own constraints and your situation with being able to actually reach that population. So, if you're asking a very general question about anxiety in young people, is it realistic to think that you're going to get a random sample of all young people? Probably not. So you have to decide, do you want to constrain your population to be a more specific group? Maybe you are at a family practice in Wisconsin in a rural town. So maybe you can say young people, age 18 to 25 at a rural clinic in Wisconsin. Maybe that becomes your population. Or maybe you are able to say, you're able to do a little more research and you're able to say that it's your sampling frame. I'm going to throw in a term there. The sampling frame is the people you are literally sampling from. Maybe though, that sampling frame is generally representative of a wider group of people. If you can justify that, then you can maybe call that wider group of people your population, as long as you make it clear how you were getting your sample from that population. But it's really important to understand from the beginning who your research actually applies to. So your population is really part of your research question. Second important thing, in the PICO model, we talked about intervention and comparison and outcome. All of those things can be variables. You can use, you have predictor variables. So did they receive an intervention or not? Maybe the dose of something they received is your predictor variable. Maybe it's something that's purely observational. Maybe height is your predictor variable. But any variable you're using, whether it's a predictor or an outcome, has to be measurable in order to really use it. So it's great to say something that like you are measuring intelligence for part of your study, whether it's a predictor or an outcome. But you have to make sure then that you have an instrument that has been shown to measure intelligence. It's kind of an abstract concept. It's not something you could just go up with a ruler and say, okay, here's what your intelligence is. So you have to have measurable variables and you have to have a plan for measuring them as part of your research question. I also mentioned here, I said you can actually measure it, and that's kind of what I'm talking about. Do you have an instrument? Do you have the tools? Do you personally have the ability to measure that variable? So that's what I mean by saying actually measuring it. You also have to make sure and consider, though, whether the variable is something you can ethically measure as well. So, for example, I'm going to give an old example, but you can't really assign people to smoke a certain number of cigarettes every day. That's not really a treatment that that you can ethically measure. And in a lot of cases, if you're at a university or if you're at a research foundation, you will have a group of people that will tell you whether something is an ethical measure. You will have a committee set up to do that, some kind of review board. But that's a very important step to not skip. If you work at a hospital, for example, you have to make sure that your hospital is okay with you taking certain measures for patients, or that doesn't compromise the patients in any way. So it's not just about making sure you can actually measure it, although obviously that's very important. You also have to make sure that you can ethically measure the thing that you're trying to measure as well. And the last part, for the most part, and I'm sure anyone can think of exceptions, but questions that you can answer with data are descriptive questions. So, how does this look in this population? I've done a lot of research using reference intervals where we're trying to find, okay, in a normal population, what values does this particular blood work have? The reason being that later we can go back and say, if we're looking at a particular animal in a clinic or whatever, we can say, oh, this is way out of range. This animal might be sick. This animal may be different from a normal population. So there's plenty of analyses that are just descriptive, plenty of research questions that don't ask for comparisons or relationships, that are perfectly valid research questions. They can be comparative. So, how is this group different from this group? How is this treatment different from this treatment? Or relational, which is how do these variables work together? Maybe two variables, maybe more variables, maybe items, on a survey, how do these items relate to each other? Maybe people, are there different groups of people in this data set and how do they relate to each other? But usually a research question will fall into one of these categories. And again, I'm sure there's exceptions, but this is often what we're going to want. And you should be able to be familiar with which one it is. So this is kind of, the general basics of what you want for a research question. These are usually all things that you could consider when you're formally writing a research question as well. So this would all be maybe part of a research question as you put it into a manuscript or a presentation. There are some other elements, though, that I think I run into as a statistician that I think also need to be considered carefully. And I also want to be clear. So, as a statistician, you don't have to have all of this when you come to me. If you're just at the beginning of your project and you come to me, then that's great because I can help you iron these things out. If you're not particularly sure how to handle an aspect of this or what it needs to look like, this is something a statistician can help you with, especially if you come early in your project. So it's always great to do that. But other things that we're really going to want to figure out. One question I often have for people is how many research questions or how many hypotheses do you actually have? So what do I mean by that? Well, sometimes people maybe don't write down their research questions explicitly and they'll have a survey. They'll be like, well, I want to know this about the people. I'm going to want to know how that's related to this thing. And, oh, well, I'm looking at all these. Why don't I throw this other thing in? And they'll come to me with a 10-question survey, which maybe is not a lot of questions. And they'll just want to kind of know how everything relates to everything else. And they'll just be like, well, I looked at these two groups of people and I wanted to know how they were different. Well, how many research questions is that though, really? It might sound like one, the way that you're currently phrasing it. But if you want to take two groups of people and compare them on 10 questions, now it's 10 separate research questions. Or if you have 10 questions and you want to look at how every question works with every other question, just to see, are there any relationships here? 10 items and you cross all of them, that's now 45 different questions that we're asking. So it's really important to determine how many research questions do you really have? Every relationship, every difference, everything that you want to look at is really technically its own research question. One thing that I personally emphasize a lot is the more questions you're actually asking, the more exploratory your study generally is. There is nothing wrong with doing exploratory analyses and kind of asking all the questions. But I think sometimes we just say, oh, this is exploratory, and then we kind of don't think about it anymore, or we emphasize the results way more than we should. Exploratory really means that we looked at a lot of things. Some things did come out as maybe being statistically significant, or we did learn some things that we weren't expecting to see. But you have to remember that when you ask a lot of questions, and this is not just a concept, but it's also mathematically you can show this, that the more things you ask when you've taken a random sample, the more likely something is to be statistically significant in your sample regardless of what, that real difference is in a bigger population or what the real relationship is in a population. So the more questions you ask, the more likely you are to incorrectly say that something is important or something has a relationship or something has a difference. So when you do more analyses, when you have more research questions, you generally cannot be as strong with your conclusions as you can as when you have fewer. So this is a reason why it's important to understand how many questions are you really asking? How many questions are part of your what you see as your big research question? And my advice is usually write out every question. If you really want to cross all 10 items on the survey that you did, go through and actually write out what you are asking with each one of those questions. Because my feeling is if you feel like it's too much to write it out in the beginning, to write out all of your 45 research questions, it's probably going to be too much to summarize the results of 45 different research questions in your manuscript as well. And it is generally inappropriate to selectively pick which research questions you want to share. So my advice is literally write out all of your research questions at the start so you know what you're really getting into, so you really understand the extent of what you're doing. Second consideration when you're writing a research question and you're trying to decide what needs to be part of it, what data do we need to collect to answer this, what does a data-based answer to your research question look like? So what data are needed to make the answer to that research question happen? And again, my advice here is draft out an imaginary answer. I don't care if you assume that there were statistically significant results or there weren't statistically significant results, but kind of put together what you think you would like to be able to say. Is a plot a good way to look at it? Is a table going to be a good way to look at the results? Is it something that you want to be able to write out in a paragraph or all of those things? But when you start thinking about, okay, what would the people reading this journal or coming to this presentation, what would they really like to know? Do they want to know how big this difference is? Do they want to look at all of these different possible things? What is it that I'm going to want to be able to say at the end that can really help you phrase your research question in the beginning and make sure you're focusing on a population that's correct, or make sure that you understand how to measure your variables. A lot of times, like if you have something that you're not sure how to measure it, you'll realize that when you're trying to draft what you think the result of this analysis could be. All right, and I have one more slide here of important elements. So another question I like to ask is what context is required to get the right answer? So what do I mean by context? I think a lot of times you ask a research question and you're like, well, is this treatment going to be different for this group than for this group? This can definitely change the analysis though if I have a different, if you need to make sure that you've accounted for other things and you've put everything in the right context. So what do I mean by this? Well, if weight changes the result of an analysis, so if an individual's weight changes how they might respond to a treatment, then we need to account for their weight. That's part of what we need to ask about. It would be how is treatment A different from treatment B when we take account of a patient's weight? Or maybe we know that let's say that would be like if weight could affect the outcome of what we're looking at. But maybe we know that weight could also affect the treatment itself. Maybe I need to include an interaction. So while your basic research question that you're asking might sound the same, how does treatment A compare to treatment B? If we don't account for weight, we might not get the right answer. So that has to be something that you think about when you're writing this research question, is not just, okay, I need to give some patients this and some patients this and record their blood pressure or whatever it is. But I also need to record these things so that we can account for them. So think about what other context needs to be adjusted for or taken care of when you're creating your research question. This is something that you might not formally include it, but it's probably part of what I'm going to need to think of as being part of your research question as a statistician. And finally, this is also important, although it may not seem like it. What will you do with the answer to this question? Because that can also change what analysis I use. It can change what approach I take to the analysis. Am I going to try to do some kind of variable selection? Do I need to include all these covariates in the model all at once? Am I going to look at things kind of two at a time? use those analyses all to answer the same research question if you don't have enough context into how it's going to be used. So again, what you're going to do with the results or how you intend for it to be used can change what analysis approach we take to it. So this is more a bigger context for your research question. So if the answer will maybe encourage more research, great. If you're doing exploratory analyses and you're looking at a lot of things and you're like, well, we found this relationship that I don't know if people have seen before, if they're aware of this, that would be something that would encourage more research. And I might take a more exploratory analysis approach to that. Is it something that's going to be used for decision making in practice? So is it going to be, okay, if we see this relationship, then we're going to treat patients with this? Or is it something like, if a patient is above this certain threshold, then I'm going to assume they're more at risk for lack of survival. And if it's going to be used for that kind of decision making, I may take another approach to it. Or if it's going to serve as a new theoretical model for how something works, that may be yet another approach where I may be very careful about not wanting to use, variable selection, wanting to make sure we're very theoretically based in what we're starting with. So depending on how the answer to a research question is going to be used, that can also change the analysis that we do. So that's important context for, okay, I have this research question and here's how the answer is going to be used. So I have some examples. Um, I don't know if again, we have chat available if people want to provide some thoughts on this. But I have a couple examples of some very basic research questions, and I'd like to go over ways in which they need to be fleshed out a little bit. So the first question is, and it sounds, when I say treatment A and treatment B, um, that sounds really generic and like nobody's going to ask this question. But sometimes the question that I get is, okay, I followed these animals over time and I want to know if the animals in this group are different from the animals in this group. And that kind of is the research question that I'm given. And it's not until I look at all of the data that I can kind of start to understand it a little bit. So I actually have some of the stuff I've recommended in the last few slides in front of me. What needs to be added to this question in order to make it a good research question, or what are some of the considerations that we need to have? If anyone wants to pop into chat with some thoughts, please go ahead. Otherwise, I'm going to start naming some ideas. One thing we need to talk about here is the population. A lot of times people kind of know the population they're working with. That would be really unusual if they didn't, but they may not have kind of thought it all the way through. So maybe be like horses. The population is horses. But then realistically, you may have horses maybe horses that are clients at a particular vet practice, or you may have horses that are part of a research herd at a campus. And so we need to think a little bit more about how what we actually have access to relates to a population. I have certainly done some work where we will maybe have two different groups of horses, and we will see that those two groups do not have the same answer to a simple question about a treatment, based on things that are different about those two groups. So one thing is the population. We want to be specific about it, and we want to list constraints. Let me write that down here. And I did not actually put anything. Let me see if I can put let's do this pen. I go back. How do I pen? Okay, here we go. So population, name specifically what it might be. Another thing, which again, like I don't think that people really in their head feel like the question is it better? But that's kind of what they have written down. And then I have to look at the data and kind of work backwards to figure out what they meant by better. Because let's say that we're looking at something that is supposed to make blood pressure lower, like a medication that's supposed to make blood pressure lower. So my assumption might be that I am looking at, better would mean more effective. So is treatment A more effective at lowering blood pressure than treatment B? But sometimes that is not what people mean at all. They might mean, is this easier to use? So is if, it's a treatment that somebody comes into a doctor for, is it easier for the doctor to administer the treatment? Or is it something that people are more likely to remember to do at home? So maybe there's, ease of use is what they actually mean by better. So I'm gonna put more effective, easier to use. Or maybe they mean, are there fewer side effects? So that's another thing that's also like really important whenever you're dealing with medicine, whether it's human or animal. What are the side effects like? And sometimes when I look at the data and I see what has been collected, the answer is it's all of these, which means we don't just have one research question. We have 10 research questions. We get back to that situation where it's not maybe as easy to just provide an answer as we might be picturing at first. So this is why it's important to, again, figure out how many research questions you actually have. What are you looking at? Some of the other things we talked about are, again, like how many research questions or hypotheses do you really have? What does a data-based answer look like to this question? So once you start thinking about it, if you want to make sure that your variables are measurable and there's something you can actually get. So let's say it's blood pressure. Sometimes it's blood pressure, and then I get systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and then the map as well. And it's really three questions, even though we really are just focusing on blood pressure. So we have to think about like when we write this up, what is it actually going to look at? When you say blood pressure, which blood pressure are you picturing? And are you picturing it the way it really needs to be? So writing out an actual imaginary answer. Do you want graphs for this? Do you want a table for this? Like, what does it look like to actually get this? And that can help you provide more context. When I talk about, getting the right answer, what else do we need to adjust for? Do we need to adjust for people's weights? Do we need to adjust for their genders? Do we maybe need to have some interactions in the model to consider whether this treatment works equally well for different groups of people? So there's a lot of things that we really need to think about, even when just comparing two treatments. And maybe it sounds like it's really straightforward. Um, there's what's straightforward to you as the domain expert, and then what's straightforward to me as a statistician who maybe doesn't know about all of the side effects, or maybe doesn't know about everything that could affect blood pressure that we may need to control for. I can think of some of them, and I can always ask the questions, but ultimately, you will probably need to be the person who tells me what we need to control for. Do I want to look at all of these things individually? Is it very exploratory? Or do I want to try to account for everything at once and really make a solid statement that, yeah, treatment A is better than treatment B, unless you are under the age of 50. And maybe then it's not. Like, what questions do we really need to answer? So go on to my second example. This is a little different. I talk about a lot of medical stuff because a lot of my projects do that, but I have a lot of projects that don't as well. And so here's a research question from language. I'm working with a similar project right now. Obviously, I'm not going to give a lot of like every detail about it, but sometimes in language, in certain languages, there are things that are related between, in words. And so let's say we want to know if word frequency, so how often a word is used in a language, is related to the length of the word. So, in English, we have a lot of words like and, the, but, and they show up all the time. And longer words, three-syllable words, four-syllable words, they're not used as commonly. So I would think there probably is a relationship between how long is a word and how often do we use it? But there's a lot involved here. And this may already sound like a sort of straightforward question, but there's a lot involved here that we need to ask. So, one thing is, what's your population? Is it every word in the language? How do you go about sampling from that? Is it, and actually a lot of languages now there's data scrapes from different sources. So you could look at social media, you can look at publicly available books written in that language. But you kind of have to decide, like, in what context are you talking about word frequency and word length? What group of words in the language? when you're going to measure this, how is this measurable? These can be tricky to measure. So again, word frequency, how do you determine how often a word is used? Because among teenagers, a word may not be used nearly as often as it is among, academic scholars. So again, that goes into choosing your data source and determining what actual part of the language are you talking about, because it's very unlikely you're going to be able to get a random sample of all words from an entire language. What do I mean by word length? Am I talking about letters? Am I talking about syllables? Am I talking about how long it typically takes to pronounce that word? So there's something you have to consider. Again, that maybe you as a domain expert are already very familiar with, but as a statistician, I may need a lot more instruction or introduction to what you mean. So make some notes here. Um, Frequency among what group or in what context? How to measure length and what really represents what you're trying to do the best. Or is it any of these things? Sometimes I ask the questions like, oh, I don't know, maybe we should look at all of those. We probably don't always want to look at all of everything. Um, and sometimes you can answer these questions based on what other people have done. Again, what does a database answer look like? Are you really just interested in, yeah, there's a relationship, and here is the strength of that relationship? Maybe we're looking at a correlation. Or if you want to be able to specifically say, yeah, if a word appears twice as often as another word, then it's this much more likely to be a three-syllable word. That's a very specific way of looking at it that requires a specific analysis. So what does your answer look like for you? If when you're thinking about writing it up and thinking about what you want to have in the end, that for a statistician, that's part of the question. What else do you need to control for? Are there different types of words in the language that, maybe nouns and verbs? Maybe you want to know if nouns have this relationship and maybe verbs don't for whatever reason. Do you need to account for something about a word that would affect its length that you just want to take care of it up front? And again, what are you going to do with this answer? Is it really just a model for how language works or for how a specific language works? Um, is there something you want to compare it to? Are you trying to make predictions about something else? These are all kind of parts of the research question that, again, maybe you don't put in the formal question, but they're things that the statistician needs to be able to think about up front. Anything that's going to help make it more quantitative. So I am at the, it's funny, I think I had about half the slides I usually have, and I still managed to go almost an hour. So maybe not a lot shorter, but maybe a lot less detailed, and maybe more overview. So my final thoughts on this are, of course, research questions and hypotheses, just because I get this question sometimes, like what's the difference? Research questions and hypotheses are different, but they are complementary. A lot of times, if you have a research question, there's a specific hypothesis or set of hypotheses that can pretty much directly be written from that research question. And no, you don't necessarily have to have both. There's no rule that says you need both. I need to be able to think about it as a hypothesis test if I am offering, a statistical, if I'm going to give you a p-value. But that's something I can do whether or not you give me something that's hypotheses. I can figure it out from your research question or from talking with you. Um, Big thing, research questions and hypotheses should be specific in terms of the population and in terms of what you want to measure. What are the variables specifically? Sometimes people will tell me, "Oh, I want to look at I don't know. I don't want to be too specific, but like I want to look at effectiveness." And then there'll be 10 variables in the data set and I won't know which ones are related to effectiveness. So, um, the more specific you can be about individual variables, the easier that is for me on my end to understand what that looks like. And they should also be measurable. They should be things that you have an idea of how to measure them before you go out and collect data. Because I have seen this happen where the research question asks one thing, but the data give something else that's a little different and it doesn't exactly match the research question. Like it vaguely sounds like it should be related. When it comes down to it, it can't actually answer the question. So make sure before you collect your data that you know what you're measuring and what it looks like. Consider how the answer will be used. and kind of the extended version of your research question. What are you going to do with it can tell me what kind of answer you need, and that can tell me what kind of analysis needs to be done. So how will that answer to your question be used? And my top recommendation really is just draft out an answer. Write down what you can of like extend, make your research questions as explicit as possible. So write them all down just to see what you're really getting into. But then draft an answer when you're forming the question. So I have this question. What would an answer to it look like? And that can help you see where you maybe haven't been explicit enough in the research question, or maybe where you're missing a measurement. That can be really helpful, I think, just to write down what an answer might look like. So I don't have any other thoughts here. We have a few minutes. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Do I also have a, I don't know if I also have a question. Yeah, I do also have a Q&A box available. So if you have any questions, please let me know. Whether you are watching live or you're watching on the recording, you're always welcome to email me. My email address is kim@krloveqcc.com. Again, it's great if you want to just say hello. If you have questions about something that I've shared, if you have ideas or things you'd like to see in future webinars, I'd love to hear from you. If you are watching this on YouTube, which I am currently posting them all to YouTube, and you want to leave a comment on YouTube, I believe I will get those. I'm currently not being overwhelmed by comments, clearly. So if you have a comment you'd like to leave with a question or any thoughts there, feel free to do that as well. Thank you again to everyone who's here right now watching it live. And of course, thanks to everyone who is checking them out on YouTube as well. All right. Bye, everyone.